Welcome to Community Matters on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. This episode is called The Duck Springs Defiance, a novel of the next Civil War. Wow. Our guest for the show is Peter Adler, the author of that book and a partner in a local firm called Guild Consulting. Welcome to the show, Peter.
Hi, Jay. Good to be here.
You know, we need to examine the political and moral choices we face right now, and your new book will help us do that, just coming up now. To start up, we're going to take a look at the video you've made about the work.
The Duck Springs Defiance, a novel of the next Civil War. This near-future tale of community, resistance, leadership, and redemption is set in a tiny hamlet in the mountains of Washington state. When the United States barrels toward a second Civil War, Washington, D.C. is attacked by militias trying to change everything. The president has been assassinated, and cities everywhere are on fire. As the country descends into chaos, a divorced former lawyer packs himself off to the remote Porky village of Duck Springs to hike, read, and ruminate on the absurdity of it all. To his surprise, he finds love, fellowship, and resistance. He joins with an emergent group of unlikely locals to defend their fragile community.
The author, Peter S. Adler, is a renowned international expert in conflict resolution. He brings that unique background and perspective to this gripping tale.
Okay, Peter, let's learn about this book. It's an odd title, isn't it? The Duck Springs, what is that? Where is that? Why is the reference? And defiance, what are they defying? And of course, you've been through a lot of conflict and conflict resolution issues. You've written a number of books and held seminars all across the country, really, on conflict resolution. So here we are, the conflict resolution type of movie. Well, actually, it's just a conflict. You never get to the question of resolution. Let's talk about the conflict you depict in this novel.
It's got multiple themes to it. So one is about the main character is a guy named Goldman, Daniel Goldman, and he is a kind of a slightly unhappy, defrocked lawyer, former Marine with a little PTSD and bad marriage. And he's heads off in the Cascade Mountains in Washington to a little town that's called Duck Springs. It's actually based on a real town that I spent 3 months in many, many years ago. And he really wants to just hike and ruminate. He's got some self-destructive tendencies, but he also is becomes part of this little community called Duck Springs, falls in love, and just as this Civil War is breaking out in the United States, and I don't want to give away the whole story, but there's a reason why the protagonists in this war, the war makers, want to get this little town. They're working on a national scale of a civil war in the U.S., but they have a particular reason to come after this little town, and he becomes part of the defense of that town.
There is a guy by the name of Dan Goldman in Congress. You were not referring to him, are you?
No, I'm not. No, he's not a real guy. This is not a real guy. This is a fictional character.
Okay.
This guy's name is Danny.
Okay. So much to ask you about. Now, this is a Civil War movie. There was a Civil War movie a year or two ago, which was really good, and I really enjoyed that. Why? Because I felt that was a possibility in these United States. And I think you're saying the same thing. This kind of chaos is a possibility in the United States, right?
That's right. And take it as a cautionary tale. I don't think it's the most likely scenario. I don't think we're going to have an active civil war, blue, gray, north, south. I just don't think it's going to happen like that. I think I have other scenarios that I think are more robust. But this makes for a great story. And I love stories. You love stories. So I wanted to tell a story about one person in a small town and that small town community dealing with this, with their own defense in the middle of chaos.
Yeah, part of the story is whether it's Goldman or some of the other characters, they march off into the woods. So the woods and survival in the woods plays a part of this. Now, you were and you've written about this in the Peace Corps, and how do you survive without the trappings of civilization around you? What role does your experience in the Peace Corps play in this book?
It's tangential. It's not direct. I've spent, as you know from our previous interactions, I lived in India for 2 years when the Peace Corps was still very young. And it was pre-computer, pre-iPad, all that stuff. We had none of that. And it was a really interesting time in my life. It was a fork in the road. And I learned to really pay attention to some pretty important things that were going on. But this was 1968, 67, 68. Yeah, and you remember 68. This is when America was in chaos. We had assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, and we had the Orangeburg massacre of students, and we had, Huey Newton saying, let's burn this town down. I think we're much more likely to go into a kind of a turning point that looks like that period of time in U.S. history, chaos. And always on the verge of violence, always on the verge of violence.
Well, I keep thinking of it as a movie because every good novel evokes a movie, and certainly this one evokes a movie. And I can see this easily as becoming a movie, just as the Civil War was a movie. This would be even a more timely movie, wouldn't it?
It would be. It's very timely. And I hope, there's somebody who picks up on that. But I'm just happy to see it out the door and see if it gets read by people and hungry for conversation about it.
What's the difference in writing a novel versus writing all the documentary books you've written?
I wrote five other nonfiction books that were more professional or about Hawaii. And completely different. And this actually started, the germination of this thing started with January 6th, 2001, which I was convinced was it was a true insurrection. And of course, it's all, part of Trump's war on history, change the name, get rid of that. But that started there. And then it germinated during the darkest days of COVID and Trump 1.0. And so, and I actually started just experimenting, and I kind of enjoyed it. I was having fun doing it. And so it turned into this. It turned into a novel, which I think is a good read. It's not a potboiler because it's got also, it's got a lot of important philosophic themes in there that are really important, I think. So it's more than just a potboiler that you read on the airplane.
That promotional video that you made includes a picture of the Capitol burning. And that reminds me of Designated Survivor with Kiefer Sutherland, if you remember.
I do remember that.
Were you thinking of that too?
I was not, but I can see the parallels. I understand the linkages there, that we're in a time of explosive violence. Today's news is just full of that with our fight with Iran and, but the challenge is that, Jay, I think we're sleepwalking through the demise of democracy. I hope it'll change. There'll be turning points. But I have this feeling like, we're at a crisis moment where people are just kind of dozing because they don't have the power to change anything. Maybe that'll change. Maybe there'll be scenarios where that changes in the midterms and the elections, or new coalitions and new alignments. But so this is one scenario. This is not the only scenario of the future, but it is a scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel the same way about the world today and people becoming so immune, so uncaring already. They've lost touch with the violence in Venezuela, violence in Ukraine, violence now today in Iran. There will be violence soon, I think, in Cuba. It goes on, and it's all the United States. We have turned into a different kind of country, and in your book, we are turning into a different kind of country. But right. you mentioned, the philosophical aspect of this, and I would like to ask you about some of that because you've read widely, and I'd like to ask you to compare, or maybe better said, give us the influences of some of the great figures, philosophical figures we've seen, and the great novelists we've seen in our lives. Albert Camus, Ernest Hemingway, Nikos Kazantzakis, Norman MacLean, Henry David Thoreau, one of my favorites, Mark Twain, one of my favorites, and of course, the law and the Constitution, the rule of law. It's all in the book, isn't it?
Albert Camus in particular shows up a lot in the book because Goldman has thought a lot about Camus. And Camus is, I've read a lot and studied him. I read a lot of it while I was in the Peace Corps in India. I read, huge amounts of Camus. And he was an existentialist philosopher. And he was, Algerian French and a man of two worlds. And he actually really pondered what he called the absurdity of life. He thought life was absurd philosophically. Said, there's no inherent meaning. There is no inherent anything other than the pulse that tells us we're alive. Other than that, what do we have? And his whole life, his whole career as a writer, thinker, he was really a storyteller more than everything else. But he wound up with a Nobel Prize before he died in a car crash in the late 50s. But his whole life was a search for something that said it's more than absurd. There's a meaning in life. And that's part and parcel of what goes on inside this story, too. That there's a search, there's a hunger, a desire to try to understand it. And Camus basically said, I don't want to be a victim and I don't want to be an oppressor. I want to be someone who believes in liberty and always searches for that. So Camus is important in this book. He's a figure that keeps popping up.
Does Jean-Paul Sartre play a role here and the idea of existentialism?
Minor. He's mentioned, but Camus is much more of a main thinking character that plays into this.
Why do I feel that sometimes, you write a novel and you're really expressing views you would have expressed in a nonfiction book, but you're trying to reach people on another level, on a more profound, a more personal level, a level that will stick with them, perhaps more than a nonfiction book. Did you have that thought when you were writing this book?
I had that thought as I was moving towards the end of the book and really trying to polish it. And I had a couple of friends who were very good editors and helped on substance as well as, typographic stuff. And I had a couple of really good friends who were really helpful on this, who loved this, fell in love with the story, and they wanted others to fall in love with the story. And so, yeah, it's a pondering of what's the meaning of our life, what's the possibilities in our lives, or is it really absurd and it doesn't matter? Because that's where Camus started there, but he ended in a very different place. He became a part of the resistance to the Nazis in Paris.
So many touch points we can relate to today. You've been working on this at least for the past year, and you're trying to track on what's happening in this country and the world for that matter. America first, but America everywhere. How shall I say that? And
I think you said it.
And so you had to keep current with the news because things have changed every day. It seems like we've had the zone being flooded every day, sometimes multiple times. And I suggest to you that if you would write the same book, the same general approach to things, the general environment to things, a year from now, it would be completely different, wouldn't it?
It could be. It might very well be. And again, I feel like we're edging towards some turning points. We're moving towards that. And when and where and how it'll happen, I mean, who can read the future? We don't know what's going to come. But if we know that what's going on right now is pretty dark. It's pretty dark. And I know I'm in sympathy with you on that. And when I listen to your other shows, we're in a bad place.
Yeah. Well, let me go back and ask about Hawaii. Most of your life you've been in Hawaii,
right?
And very simpatico with Hawaii and all the principles and moral parameters of Hawaii, which are what keeps a lot of us here. Why didn't you include Hawaii? Why did you go to the state of Washington and talk about a fictitious town? Why did you have to construct that when you could have found a location here?
The setting emanates from almost 4 months that I spent doing what this main character does. I went at a certain point, before I had kids, I went to the Washington State. I borrowed a Carmen Ghia from my brother, who lives in Seattle, and I found this little cabin that a friend loaned me, and it was near this little town. The actual town is called Goose Prairie, And it's not Duck Springs, it's Goose Spring. And I spent 3 months there, and I thought I was going to do a lot of writing. I brought along a typewriter and a lot of books and a lot of paper. Nothing came, nothing happened. So I went hiking. I walked all over the place. I hiked all over the mountains. And I particularly used to go into this little town, which is fictitiously called Duck Springs. And there was a little restaurant there, and I would go in, and I started to make friends with some of the people in this town, even though I wanted to live on the outskirts. I left, and I didn't want to be a part of the town, but I became a part of a little community peripherally. And so the setting itself is actual one that I've experienced way back. I could have set this in the Kohala Mountains, perhaps. I could have set it up in, on Kaho'olawe or something like that. But it was a reminiscence of that experience that drove part of the setting for the plot.
The thoughts you might have had a year ago or years ago when you were in Washington just bubbled up after all those years.
That's exactly right. That's exactly how it worked. It germinated, gestated over a long period of time.
Was it a joy to write this book? I can see for you that it would be.
I had fun writing it. It's a struggle, because I'd never done fiction before, but I had a couple of good people who were really helpful to me on this. And they really read a couple of versions of it and tracked and said, this doesn't work with that. This is inconsistent. And so I got a lot of good advice, and I take editing very well. I'm not I'm stuck on myself that I have to have the last word. And I listen to people who are smarter than me about writing and about fiction. So I had a good time. I don't know if I'll ever write any more fiction, but I quite enjoyed doing this one.
What about dialogue? One thing it's not in your books before, your nonfiction books, your documentaries and all that, is dialogue. And dialogue is really an important part of writing a novel, for sure. How did you handle the dialogue? I would imagine you talk to yourself, no?
That's in part the way it is. I saw a movie a few years ago about a writer who was trying to explain to somebody else how he writes fiction. And he said, he turns to this person and he says, look down the street and tell me what you see. Well, I see cars and I see a guy mowing the lawn and I see, some people walking and their dogs. And he said, that's good. That's the nonfiction observation. Tell me what's going on inside the houses right now. That's fiction. That becomes the fiction. And you have to invent the dialogue and the discussion and the characters and the plot, which was fun. I mean, I really enjoyed doing it. So, in some ways, it's like getting it out of your system, Jay. It's like, I got to get this thing unspooled and told this tale.
You mentioned before the show that one of the factors in the Dan Goldman character, Danny Goldman, if you will, was you. You saw yourself. Can you talk about that, the connection?
Part of it is the connection to the existential moment that we're in, which I feel very strongly. I feel like we're at a moment when people like us, who are now of a certain age, as we are, we're struggling to figure out what can we do. And I already know that I'm too old for the barricades. I'm too cheap for therapy. And I'm probably the only thing I know how to do is write and think and get it out there. And I enjoy talking with people who are also struggling with the same thing, even if they have different views. That's okay. I love that. That's a dialogue. And all my life as a mediator and consultant, I've tried to help people have productive dialogues. That's part of what I do. It's part of what I know how to do. So I think it's embedded in the book. I hope it's embedded. I hope it comes through.
You've said, and I agree with you, that we live in dark times, but you're a conflict resolution person. You've dedicated your professional life to conflict resolution. You're really good at it. You have a certain way of looking at the world, looking at the human condition, to help people resolve conflicts. And of course, that's a subject all in itself. We've talked about that before. But what's the resolution here? Was there any resolution in this novel? Any suggestion of what the resolution might be?
There is. And again, I don't want to give away the full story, but a lot of what I've learned over the years is about negotiation and discussion. And there comes a moment in this story about this small town and these characters where they have an opportunity to confront the architects of this new civil war who are coming. They're squeezing down. They're trying to get through this little town for particular reasons, which I don't want to disclose. I'd rather let people read the book and find out why they're doing it. But they have a reason. But in the end, there's a confrontation. And in the end, what I've learned about negotiation and conflict resolution and mediation, a lot of that shows up at the end. So there is what I would call an optimistic ending, although there's been a lot of damage. And I think in the end, we know that, fights come to a conclusion after there's a lot of pain. You know that as a lawyer, people have to go through pounding each other first. And before that, and then eventually at some point it becomes a moment for resolution, a moment to settle things. And that happens in the book. It happens in the story.
I can't wait to get to that part because I firmly agree with you that the way to peace is through violence and war. If you have enough of it, then you find out that it's better to have peace. We have learned that. We as a country have learned that so many times.
Quote from Robert Frost in one of his poems, and it says, "The way out is through. It's always through. And there's no avoiding. The way out is through." And in the book, they go through. There's a throughness to the storyline.
Who are you writing this for? What audience do you imagine in your mind would be sitting there by the fireside reading this book?
That's a really good question. And I don't know that I have a really good answer to it because it's, again, one of these things I had to get it out of my system. And, but I can imagine people who have political sensitivities and the worries that you and I are even sharing in this discussion about the future of the country, saying, is this a real scenario? What would it look like? What would it happen if there was a civil war? What if it broke out? It doesn't have to be exactly like this. Maybe it's another one. Maybe it comes from the left. Maybe it comes from the right. Who knows? But what would happen to small towns? What would happen to small places that really still have community life left in them? They're not like big cities. Not like New York or Chicago or LA or San Francisco, where people are very fragmented. There's a lot of small towns that are alive and that and are doing really interesting things. And town is one of those. Is modeled after one of those. I would say it's probably a mix of both. There's I think I referred to this. There's a bumper sticker in in the restaurant where people go in the men's room that says, "I may not agree with your bumper sticker, but I will defend to the death your right to stick it." So I kind of think that it's a quirky place. This is a very quirky place. And there are Black people there, there are white people there, there are older people there, there are younger people there. It's a kind of an escapist town. But it's interesting that there are places like this, Jay, that are still alive in the United States. And where community is, I wouldn't call it intact. It's always fragile. But where people huddle and they get together and they know each other and they get together and at the barber shop and at the local restaurant. And, and I experienced some of that when I was actually in the little town that's the setting in my mind for this story.
That reminds me of a discussion around de Tocqueville, who said that democracy is tumultuous and messy and whatnot, but he also said democracy is based on community. And you must have community, and a lot of people argue today we no longer have that. And perhaps you are thinking that this town is an example of the kind of community that can save us. Am I right?
Yes, I think it has the spirit that we remember, and it's still alive. I think we live in a world that is so fragmented by the news and by television, by social media, and by the big cityness of everything. But there are small towns, there are small places everywhere that still have a lot of life left in them, and where people jump up and do things that are civically engaged in their own community. And you interview people all the time who do that. You know people here in Hawaii that are alive and working on compelling community things. I think there's more to it than most of us recognize through the mass media and social media.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it's true, especially in Hawaii. Let me expand your readership just for a moment. In your video, you identify some of the places that you could buy the book, see the book, read the book. And God willing, it'll become a movie. It'll become popular.
Mm-hmm.
Let's assume for a moment that this is a national phenomenon, that people read your book. And I will mention it again, Duck Springs Defiance, and it's about the next civil war. That's pretty catchy in a way. And I wonder, if this book reaches everyone, the country becomes aware of it. What do you hope to tell them? Because in a book like this, there is an agenda. You can't not have an agenda in a book like this. In fact, these days, anything that deals with these issues has to have an agenda to be of any interest at all. And so how would you like to change public opinion, public thought with this book, assuming that everyone sees it, everyone knows, everyone reads it? How would you like to change public opinion?
A colleague of mine named Nancy Rogers, who's the former dean of the law school at Ohio State, the Ohio State, as they like to say there in Ohio. And she's a former provost and a dean and a very thoughtful person. And she commented a little bit on this. She said, I would hope this would help us stop blindly sleepwalking through what is going on. In other words, they'd say, I'm going to do what I can do that's within my reach to do, whether it's go out on the march or whether it's vote, get or mobilize the voting or whatever people can do to change what is going on. And I kind of, there's an awakening that may be happening. I don't know. I want to be optimistic about that there's maybe an awakening that's starting. The No Kings stuff and the indivisible movement that is happening here and elsewhere. So I think I thought she hit it right on the nose. Nancy said, we're sleepwalking at the moment. Maybe this will help us move beyond that. And we do what we can do within our reach. There's only things that we can that we have within our touch. So I don't have a prescription. I don't have something that I sell. Do this, do that. Here's the anecdote. I think that the antidotes are out there and they're revealing themselves slowly but surely. A lot of it will come down to the midterm elections in the short term and to the presidential election in the next presidential one. So we're in a democracy and power is spread out. And right now, the powers of people who are in opposition to what is going on politically and they don't have a lot of power, but that will change. We've gone through things like this in the past, Jay. You know that. We went through McCarthy in the 50s. We went through, Andrew Jackson, who was a little bit like Trump. So it's not like this is a foreign experience or new. It's new in the depth of it, but I think we will reach a turning point. I think there will be a turning point. I'm optimistic in the long run, even though I'm pessimistic in the short term.
Peter, are you talking about the resistance?
Yes, absolutely. And people resist in different ways. I mean, I've had somebody sent me an email and they said, we'd love it if you would show up to a pajama party that's going to be talking about this. I don't do that stuff. That's not me. I can't do that. Ask Fidell to do it, not me. So we're doing. We have to do what we can do within our rush. Within our orbit. You do that through ThinkTech. You present ideas. You stimulate thinking. You ask tough questions. That's what you do. What I did was write this little novel, and maybe I'll write some more stuff about it. Who knows? But we can only do what we can do, and I'm probably a little old for the barricades of the 1960s, and I'm probably not going to go into therapy because I'm too cheap to do that. So I'm going to write. I'm going to rant and do my own ranting.
I want to ask you a completely unfair question, if you don't mind. Can you find a paragraph, a short paragraph in the book, and just read it to us so we can get the flavor of your writing and of your approach?
Interesting that you asked that, because I was going back and thinking about certain pieces. And this is again the link to Albert Camus. Danny Goldman and a couple other people spent a lot of time talking about Camus and understanding his life in the context of war. In the context of war. So here's a paragraph on that point. In the fury of World War II, Albert Camus was a human rheostat, an instrument to manage the flow of resistance in the service of liberation. Being French and Algerian, he came from two worlds, and he was hungry for authenticity. But his evolving discernments touched people who came in contact with him. He never did answer with convincing logic whether humans are inherently conniving and untrustworthy or intrinsically cooperative and generous. He seemed to accept we are both, and his personal answer was his vow to be neither an oppressor nor a victim. So that's the Camus piece. There's a lot of other pieces in there that I could read and give you a flavor of the book, and especially the setting and all that stuff. But I think this theme of this, we're at an existential moment, I think is powerful. And I hope that comes through in the book.
One last thing, Peter, we always frequently we offer our guests to leave their parting thoughts with our audience. And I wonder if you could spend a little time telling them what you would like them to remember from this discussion and from the book.
And that we are barreling towards tough moments, tougher moments than we even have now. We are moving pretty fast. Every day is a cascade of news. And we're going to have to confront this. And we confront it in a democracy through our elections and through our regulations and through the rule of law, which is getting weakened all the time. Weakened. I hope people will pay attention. I hope people will think about this book not as an inevitability, but as a scenario, and also ponder other scenarios in which change may happen. Because I think there are other possibilities, not just a fight, not just a big war in which a lot of people lose their lives and there's a lot of damage. So I hope people will take it as a cautionary tale, but also evoke their thinking about where we are and where we're going and where we need to go.
Yeah, awareness. And that's
right.
very important, because a lot of people, don't want to be aware. They avoid being aware these days, and we can't let that happen to us as a society. We have to be aware. So this book, your effort at expressing yourself on these moral issues is very important. And thank you for your service. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to Peter Adler, associated with Guild Consulting. I'm Jay Fidell, host of Community Matters. The title of this episode has been The Duck Springs Defiance, a novel of the next Civil War. Wow. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha. Aloha, Peter.
Aloha, Jay.